Welcome to the Exploress, time traveling through women's history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. Why, hello there. It's time for another installment of the Exploress Book Club, in which I interview authors of historical fiction that centers women of the past. This time, I'm talking to Victoria Christopher Murray, the author of Harlem Rhapsody, which whisks us back into the Harlem Renaissance to meet its most formidable and oft-forgotten literary heroine. So, grab your red pen and your best 1920s skirt suit. Let's go traveling. But first, a shout-out to some of my patrons. My newest pirate queen, Robin. My warrior queens, Alexis, Amanda, Kate, Gail, Ika, Jen, Jessie, June, Neve and Sloan, MCF and Sarah. My Imperial Empresses, Faye and Whimsy Soapworks, Alyssa, Letitia, Sally, Samara and Teresa. And my Lady Pharaohs, Bridget, Cheryl, Kot, Kate, Kimberly, Laura, Lori, Sophie, and the delightful Courtneys. Patrons are a huge help in keeping the show going. They also get access to the video version of this chat with Victoria, along with some fun visual aids. And for the whole month of August 2025, anyone can watch it for free. To find it, just click on the link in my show notes. Hello, Victoria. Thank you so much for joining us on the Exploress.
I am very excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Well, I'm thrilled to have you to talk about your book, Harlem Rhapsody, which is a wonderful book, and I think that my listeners are really going to love it if they haven't read it yet. So I was hoping for those who haven't read it that you might be able to pitch the book for us.
Okay, well, thank you, because I love talking about this book. But Harlem Rhapsody is a historical novel, and it's about a woman named Jessie Redmon Faucet, who, when we say the words Harlem Renaissance, it should be her face that comes up before everybody else's. But nobody's ever heard of her. So I like to describe Jessie as a woman of first. She was the first Black woman or young Black girl to graduate from the Philadelphia High School for Girls, a very prestigious school that's still prestigious today. She was the first Black woman to graduate from Cornell University, the first Black woman to graduate Phi Beta Kappa, at least that's what she thought during her day, the first Black woman to be, first woman ever to become the literary editor of the Crisis magazine. And in that role, she was the first person who discovered every single Harlem Renaissance writer we know today as legends. So she discovered County Cullen when he was 16, Langston Hughes when he was 17. Jean Toomer, she taught him when he was in high school. Nella Larson, who everybody knows from her novel The Passing, was a young woman in her early 20s. There is hardly a Harlem Renaissance writer who was not touched by Jessie Redmon Faucet. And so this is the story of what I think are the 6 most important years of her life, which was when she was the editor of the Crisis magazine, the most influential magazine in the country for Black people, or news, I should say, about Black Americans at that time. And this is when she was the literary editor and she really started the Harlem Renaissance.
Amazing. And we'll talk a little bit about why you think most of us have not heard of her and don't necessarily think about her when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance in a little bit. But first, I want to talk about Harlem itself. So on the Exploress, we did a whole season on the 1920s. We delved into what life was like, everyday life was like for women. And we did an episode on some of the influential jazz singers and Black performers of the time, but we didn't talk a lot about the literary scene, the Black literary scene specifically. So I'm excited to talk about that. But I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about Harlem in the 1920s. This is such an incredible, vibrant neighborhood and a place where so much was happening. So can you tell us a little bit what Harlem was like in the 20s?
that time, and thank you for asking that, because I think somebody told me the other day that Harlem is another character in this book, and I absolutely love that thought. Yeah, I love that I did that, because I actually moved to Harlem for about 5 weeks to really get the feel of it. I'm from New York, but had never lived in Harlem. So at that time, think about this. This was 1919 when the book opens up. And one of the things I never considered in my life until I was writing this book, I never considered that this was only 50 years after emancipation. It was only 50 years after the end of slavery. And so 1919, and there were really two worlds happening. I always say it was the best of times because World War One was over, soldiers were coming home victorious, the women were getting the right to vote. So it was the best of times in America, but it was the worst of time for a group of Americans because Black soldiers came home to their own war on their own, in the streets of their own country. So it was the best of times and worst of times. But with the rise of white supremacy and Jim Crow and lynchings, there was this little corner in America, a little corner in the Northeast, a little island called Manhattan, and then a little spot on the top of Manhattan called Harlem. And it was a very interesting place because that was the best of times for Black Americans. There was the great migration from the South, where a lot of Black Americans were leaving and looking for new opportunities in the North, and they moved to New York. And then there were Northern Blacks who, at this point, they were getting college educated. Jessie had her master's degree. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the editor of the Crisis magazine, was the first Black man to graduate from Harvard University. So it was this little corner where there was, for the first time ever in history, a rise of Black pride. A Black person could look in the mirror and be proud, even if they, because half of the Black Americans in the country had been enslaved. And so even if they weren't educated, they could be proud of what was happening for their race. And so with this rise of Black pride, there was an interest now in Black music, Black theater, Black art, Black fashion. You can't have anything without fashion. And Black literature.
And Harlem was, as you say, it was really the hub of it all. And it is another character in your book. And it's so immersive. You really put us there and give us this feel, what it might have been like to be walking down the street there and working there, which I just love about the book. So this is, as you say, such an interesting point in American history, especially for women. And I think most especially for Black women. You have such duality, you have opportunity, you have this flowering of culture, but then you also have this really dark side. There was a lot of inequality on so many different levels, and we've talked about that a little bit on the show. But I want to talk a little bit about the research you did specifically into the women of the Harlem Renaissance. I read in an interview you had done that when you were starting your research, you really started by looking at trying to discover who were the women of this period, who were the women behind the scenes as part of this movement. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about what life was like specifically for Black women, these Black women who you discovered at this really interesting time.
So it was interesting because I could hardly discover the Black women. Like, I Googled women of the Harlem Renaissance and Langston Hughes' name came up and County Cullen. And I said, oh my goodness, Google, I didn't know you were a misogynist. I said, women? Clearly, I said women. And so, Black and white women were really hidden in history. Like, it was almost like they buried us under layers and layers of male achievement. Even though there were women who had done a lot of this, and men got the credit for it. And so there wasn't a lot. One of the things, Kate, that I really discovered that was amazing to me, I didn't know how, and I don't know if the word is bad, but how bad we had it as women, Black women, white women. When I think of the 1920s, before I wrote this book, all I thought about was women didn't have the right to vote. And so that has always been my focus. I had no idea that women could not get an apartment lease in their name. I had no idea that women couldn't have a bank account in their name. Like, that doesn't even compute. I can't get that to compute in my mind, because you can work, but a man had to manage your money. And so that's what it was like for women. And Jessie felt like a woman to me who was born in the 20th century with 21st century sensibilities. So she was 100 years ahead of her time, talking about a career. And women, even in her own family, was like, a career? What's a career? Your job is to be a wife and a mother. Yeah, she would have, and she didn't want to be married. Nobody could believe that, but she wanted a career, and she knew there was no way to have both. No, there was no way to have both. And so there was just this very specific way women were supposed to be. We always make this joke about barefoot in the kitchen. They were supposed to be barefoot and in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting to me in my research because often, certainly in the research that I do when I'm looking at history, what I often find is the stories of the rich and influential women, and often the white rich influential women, and what their day to day was like, when it's like, but what about the majority of women?
Yeah,
And the majority of women in the 1920s, most of them had to work. They couldn't afford
yeah,
to, and I remember being really struck by, I'm not going to remember the statistic now, but the percentage of Black women who had to work to help support their
yeah.
families. They didn't have the luxury of giving up
Yeah,
work when they got married.
there was nobody who could stay home. There was no one
Yeah.
who could
So
stay
they were
home.
managing childcare and working, often really difficult jobs, physically demanding jobs. And they were expected to kind of, be the wife in every sense of the word. So, yeah, there's
Yeah.
so much hidden history here. So, speaking of that hidden history, I mean, Jessie is not nearly as well known as she should be as part of this movement. She was working, as you say, for The Crisis, which was this incredibly influential magazine, the official magazine of the NAACP. And she had this really important role in fostering what we think of as the Harlem Renaissance. She discovered a lot of writers and artists who we think of as synonymous with this time. So, can you tell us a little bit about some of the women specifically that she became friendly with and that she helped to mentor and bring into the spotlight?
Yeah, so the women I love, like Nella Larson, I would probably think of as first, because people recently we had a movie passing, but Nella Larson was married to a man who was the second Black man in the country to get a PhD in physics.
Oh, wow.
But she was trained as a nurse, but had this love for literature. And so Nella Larson became one of the women who integrated the New York Public Library under the direction of another very influential woman. Ernestine Rose was a librarian of the New York Public Library. And when she got to Harlem, she said, "What do you mean we're not going to have any Black people here? We don't have any Black people in the library. How am I going to have a library and build it for the community and not have people that look like it?" And so Ernestine Rose, by herself, a very important woman in the Harlem Renaissance, she doesn't get enough credit. This was a white woman who just believed in the integration of the races. She was an integrationist, but certainly in a library. And so the first two women who became librarians under Ernestine Rose were friends and had been mentored by Jessie Redmon Faucet. So it was all of those people that kind of worked together. And women of the Harlem Renaissance, something that most people won't know. I read a fabulous book called Miss Anne, White Women of the Harlem Renaissance. White women were so important in the Harlem Renaissance, and they have been as erased as Jessie Redmon Faucet. And the reason they became so important were there were, and you were talking about this, these wealthy white women who were older in their 70s, and they were rich, well off, and they didn't want to sit home and drink tea and just go out with friends. They were very, very interested in the Black culture. And these women believe that there had been no books written by Black people that didn't have that weren't slave narratives, or that didn't have Blacks as slaves or servants. And Jessie Redmon Faucet, that was another first. She was the first Black person to write about the Black middle class. And when she wrote that novel, the white women were like, there has to be more than one. And so they became patrons of the Harlem Renaissance. And they would give, because especially the biggest woman who was in my novel, Charlotte, she believed that the only thing that was stopping Black literature from moving forward was that writers didn't have the money. They couldn't survive. They had to go do other things. And so those women, and I do talk about them, are very important to the Harlem Renaissance. The librarians were important to the Harlem Renaissance. And then I think Jessie knew that women were going to be hidden, because she made one of the things I wasn't able to do as much of in the book as I wanted to. I did have it in there, but we cut out some pages. I figured people would get tired of reading a 700-page book, but she really focused on the women. She mentored more female writers than she did male writers, but it's the twist of history and the way our country is that we remember the male writers and don't know the female writers. But some of the names that people may recognize besides Nella Larson is Zora Neale Hurston. She was a mentor for Zora Neale Hurston, and just Anne Spencer, who was one of the first women poets to get her book published. And I'm making up these numbers in my head, but if Jessie mentored 10 male authors, she mentored 20 female authors. And most of their names were lost in history along with hers.
Oh, so interesting. And it's such a wonderful fact about her that it's like she had this sense that their voices were going to be pushed to the side, and she really tried to be a champion for them. And she, as you say, she herself was not just fostering these writers, she was also a very talented writer herself. She wrote several novels. Why do you think, so you talked about how some of these wealthy white women had discovered Jessie's work and been like, oh, this exists, how wonderful, there must be more of it. Why do you think Jessie's work seemed to cut through in ways that other Black writers of the time maybe didn't?
I think it cut through, and that's a really good point. Jessie was the most prolific writer of the Harlem Renaissance, more than any male, more than any female, because she wrote in every single issue of the Crisis magazine, which I find fascinating. And she wrote 4 novels on her own during that time. But the reason I think she broke through, I had a chance to read some of the articles and some of the reviews. When she wrote her first novel, There Is Confusion, it was like a thunderbolt in the white community. There was some really, like the New York Times wrote a wonderful piece saying, but this is what the piece said. There Is Confusion is so wonderful. It talks about Black people we've never known. Can you believe a Black woman wrote it? That was the, and then it went from high praise like that all the way to some really horrible things where people said she got rejection letters where people said, your writing is fine, but we don't recognize these characters. You have written Black characters as if they're white. You've written Black characters that make decisions like white people make decisions. And I wonder what she said. Well, so that's why it cut through. No one had ever read a book, ever, about college-educated Black people because we were only 50 years after emancipation. So that's something that's hard for you and I to imagine. But we were 50 years out. As I said, half of the Black Americans had been enslaved. They were still alive and they had been enslaved. I think there was a 2% Black high school graduation rate, but almost everybody who graduated from high school went to college and went on to get their masters. And so she cut through because no one had ever seen a book like that ever before. And so she cut through for white America. And then during the Harlem Renaissance, Black literacy, I can't remember the numbers now, but it was something like increased like 100% because Black people had no reason to read before. And then with the crisis and books now being written by Black people for the first time ever, Now people had a reason and a desire to read.
Yeah, because finally there were books where they could see themselves and see their
Yeah.
friends and see their lives reflected on the page. And you talk about this in the book. This comes up many, many, many times, that part of what was driving Jessie and driving the Harlem Renaissance was this idea of lifting Black people up, of reflecting
Yes.
their lives, of putting them forward in a way they hadn't been put forward before. And as you say, taking real pride in their lives, in their culture, in what they were creating, which I
Yeah.
love.
For the first time. It was the first time ever. I mean, it's
Mm.
so hard for me to understand. It's me, a Black child from a Black middle class family raised in predominantly white neighborhoods. It was so hard for me to, even at my age, to sit down and understand that time. I always
Mm.
tell people that if you had told me when I was 14 years old, when I first started studying the Harlem Renaissance in school, if you had said it happened 50 years ago, that would have sounded like 500 years ago. I was 14. I said,
Mm.
but from where I sit now, 50 years ago sounds like last Tuesday. And so I realized how short a period of time and
Mm.
the accomplishments that were made just 50 years after emancipation, and how people, I can imagine the pride. I can imagine it. I can imagine people who had been formerly enslaved running into someone like Jessie and seeing her college, her college diploma from Cornell, her grad degree from the University of Pennsylvania, her another master's degree from La Sorbonne in France. I mean, I
Mm.
just can't imagine what it was like for people to see that and the pride they must have felt.
Absolutely. And as you say, she was pioneering in so many ways. She was doing so many things for the first time. She was a first. And that takes such bravery and such courage and such self assurance, the things that she did. And it's an incredible thing to read about in your novel, to see her doing all of this. Um, and just the heart that she brought to everything is incredible to me.
Yeah. And like you said, it's courage because she had to fight men and women. And she had to fight during that time almost more sexism than racism. Because it was, they just could not understand a woman in her role. And not even W.E.B. Du Bois, because the crux of the story is how she wants to become the editor of the Crisis magazine, and people often say, "Well, why didn't he give it to her?" And I don't blame him. 50 years after emancipation, when they didn't even let women take mathematics classes, isn't that crazy? Like women couldn't take math or science classes. They could only take liberal arts and languages. That's crazy. That is crazy. And so, but how could someone like Du Bois say, "I'm going to turn this over to you," when you don't even? I mean, I'm sure they didn't say it this way, but you don't know how to balance a checkbook. You've never been given a checkbook, so how are you going to run a big enterprise like this? Women didn't do it.
Yeah, that's right. And despite everything she wrote, like you said, she was prolific, all of her accomplishments at the crisis, she still was essentially driven out of publishing, which must have been
Yeah.
incredibly frustrating for her. So, can we talk a little bit more about that, about the kind of sexism and the barriers that she faced, why you think she faced them, and just sexism, especially for Black women in this space?
I just think it was the time. I think there's a difference between the sexism she faced and the sexism we face. The sexism we that she faced, I almost can understand W.E.B. Du Bois saying to her, "You can't be the editor of this magazine. You're a woman. You've never been trained in how to balance a checkbook. How are you going to negotiate prices for paper? You've never learned anything like that. How are you going to run this big industry?" The sexism we face, we people look at us and know we've been educated. They know we have learned these things. They're just saying they're doing it better because they're men. So it was a different thing. I almost can't fault the men because women hadn't been trained. And so when the kind of ambition she had was unheard of and made women even look at her saying, why? I mean, I read letters where women were saying, I don't want the right to vote. Like, why should I worry my head about the difference between a senator and a congressman? Or women who believed, and I mean, look at what we've gone through even in this country. People can't vote for a woman for president. And I've heard women say it, and I've heard men say it. And this is now, and it's because they believe there's going to be some kind of emotional thing. I mean, the people we got now are kind of emotional. I mean, it's just, I don't understand. It has nothing to do with your gender. It has to do with your temperament. And so she was just up against not only men not being able to see her that way, but they couldn't see her that way because of far more than her gender. They couldn't see her that way because they know she had never been trained in that. And everything she learned at the crisis, she self-taught herself.
So interesting. And it's it's sad to me that she ends up, well, not sad necessarily. It's not that she doesn't have a
No, it was
fruitful
sad.
rest
It
of
was
her life and
sad.
career, but to me it's sad that she reaches this pinnacle. She does so much, she's so influential, and then she leaves
Nothing.
publishing and goes back to
Nothing.
teaching. And we're at a point where most people, you say, do you know, even someone who knows about the Harlem Renaissance, you say, do you know Jessie Redmon Faucet? And they say, who?
And I'm a person, I've been writing about the Black middle class for 28 years. Full-time writer. I have 30 novels, and she was the first one to write what I write, and I had never heard her name. And sometimes I get sad. I'm a little annoyed with myself that I was never curious to even ask who was the first one, because there have been so many. It never occurred to me that there was a first one. You know what I mean? I've stood on her shoulders for 100 years without realizing I've stood on her shoulders. I was standing on her shoulders. And so it was I think it was sad because when she finally decided to leave the crisis, so many people say to me, with her relationship with W.E.B. Du Bois, and he wasn't going to give her this, why didn't she leave sooner? She didn't leave sooner because what were her choices? There were no women in publishing. So she had to make it work there or not make it work at all. And when she finally decided, okay, it's time to leave, think about what she had done. She was leaving when the Crisis magazine was on top. She was leaving when she had discovered all these people, and everyone gave her the credit at that point for discovering them. She was leaving when she had written this big novel to critical acclaim. She was leaving at the very, very, very top. And she knew the white founders of the NAACP. So she had influential people who just loved her. So there was no better time for her to leave. And when she left and she asked one of the founders of the NAACP, who was a founder of a publishing company. She asked for his recommendation to be able to go there. And she even had a suggestion about remote work. She was like, I know you don't want to see a Black woman, especially maybe even a woman, in the office, and I can work from home. And they told her no. And she had to go back to teaching. And I think it was a sad life for her after that.
Yeah, it's such a shame, such an incredibly talented woman, and to have chops like that, to have achieved everything she achieved and still be at a point where she's like, no one will give me a job, no one will give me a chance. It is,
No
as you
one.
say, it is sad.
And she was a literary editor, and I think she was talking to the publishing companies about starting off as a proofreader. She was willing to go to the bottom, and because she knew she was smart enough to work her way to the top. She knew she could do it.
Yeah.
But she never got the chance.
What an incredible woman. Well, so why do you think that we don't know her name? Why do you think, given what she did in such a short time, she isn't a bigger part of this story, or hasn't been until recently?
Until now, yeah. I think it really is because of sexism. I mean, I'm not kidding when I say if she mentored 10 men, she mentored 20 women. We don't know any of the women. And even with Zora Neale Hurston, Zora died. It wasn't until the 1970s that people came to know Zora Neale Hurston. What happened was Zora died in obscurity. She died very poor. And one day, Alice Walker, the woman who wrote The Color Purple in the 70s, she came across some of Zora's writings and she said, why don't we all know about this woman? So Alice went to Florida looking for her, found her unmarked grave, put a marker on it, and then it became her thing to make the world know about Zora Neale Hurston. Now we're like, what do you mean we didn't know about Zora Neale Hurston? And I'm hoping the same kind of thing will happen for Jessie. That's not why I wrote the book, but I'm hoping I have a 6-year-old granddaughter, and I hope she'll say when she's 20, what do you mean you didn't know about Jessie Redmon Faucet? I think it was just a time where women, black and white, and their accomplishments were not heralded. They weren't celebrated. They were just, you go away and we're going to give all the credit to men. I can't remember her name. I think it was Rosalind Franklin who did something with DNA, and the white men took her, and this was a white woman, the men took credit for it and won the Nobel Prize. And she was the one that discovered DNA. And so this is not something that is just limited to Jessie. It was the time, and nobody expected accomplishments from women, and nobody was going to stand on a soapbox and give it to a woman. When even in the book I talk about the night that the Harlem Renaissance came to be, which was the launch of her book party. And it was a launch for her book. And the men who took over it gave more time and more attention to the black writers and gave her 5 minutes at the end at her own party. I almost feel like the beginning of the erasure of Jessie Redmon Faucet began the night of the beginning.
Wow. And she knew it too, you know. She,
She
as
knew
you
it.
wrote about, she writes a letter later, a rather scathing
She wrote
letter
a letter.
saying,
She wrote a scathing letter. Like it would have made you proud. It would have made you proud.
amazing. And I love it. You know, she tried to call them on it. She wasn't going to just slink off quietly, you know. She gave it everything she
Yeah.
had.
I think I should have found a way to print. I should have put the letter probably in the author's notes just to make every woman cheer.
Hmm. What an incredible woman. And your book, I think that you are doing that work for Jessie, or helping to bring her back into the public consciousness in such a beautiful way. And I love that. So I just have one more question for you. I know we need to wrap up. One more question. And I ask all my guests this. If you could time travel back to any time and place for a day, where would you go?
It would be the 1920s. That's very easy for me. You know, when I'm asked to do book ideas, I always start with the decades that I love the most. And the decades I love the most are the 20s and the 60s. And probably for the same reason. As a writer, I can see them. I can write about the fashion and the music and the food and everything that stands out. I'm a political nerd, so both times were very important politically and what was happening. And also for separate reasons, both of those times were the rise of Black pride. And so I was alive. I was a kid, but I was alive during the 60s, but I wasn't during the 20s. And I would love to go back to the Harlem Renaissance. It's so interesting because before I wrote about Jessie Redmon Faucet, if you had asked me, what character would you like to go back of your book or anybody else's, I don't think I really would have had one. I don't think I would have had one. Now I would love to talk to her. I would love to know if I got it right. What was it like? I would love to thank her, give her the flowers then. Because she was a woman who did what I'm doing, and she did it first and she did it better. And because of her, I'm able to do it.
Hmm. Isn't that an incredible thought? Just gives me chills to think about you going back in time and getting to sit down with
And
her and
just
hand her
talking
those
to her, right?
flowers.
And saying, look
Yeah.
what I did. I hope you're okay. And I wanted to really show you in the best way. And everybody loves you. I would love to go back and tell her, everybody loves you. They forgive you for your affair with W.E.B. Du Bois. Nobody blames you for that. That was his fault, not yours. Uh,
Yeah,
and I would
absolutely.
just love to tell her, it is just something. I had a hard time. I've written over 30 novels, but this is only my third historical novel. And I had a very difficult time leaving the story. First time I've ever written a book, and I walked around for at least a week still believing I was in the 1920s and still believing that I couldn't leave. I didn't want to leave.
Well, that's how you know you've hit on something incredible and that you've created something. I mean, as a reader, you feel the same way. It's sad to leave the story. You don't want it to end, but luckily readers can just go right back to the beginning and start again.
Well, what's so interesting about that? I used to always tell people when I would teach writing classes that if you want a reader to cry, you have to cry first. You have to cry while you're writing. If you want a reader to laugh, you have to laugh first, while you're writing. And I know I used to believe it, but I know it now because I had such a hard time leaving this book. And I can't tell you the number of people who write to me or who talk to me and say, Victoria, I got close to the end and I wanted to slow down because I didn't want the book to end. I've never had so many people tell me that.
Amazing.
So that means it happened to me first. And so then I passed it on to the readers.
Oh, I love it. Well, it is an incredible book. And listeners, if you haven't checked it out yet, you really must. You must go and do that. So thank you so much, Victoria, for joining us and for talking about Harlem Rhapsody. It's been a delight to have you.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Great questions. And I'm so glad you enjoyed this book. Jessie will be happy. If I ever get to time travel, I'll tell her.
Thanks so much to Victoria for joining us. You can buy a copy of Harlem Rhapsody at the Exploress Bookshop. Buying there benefits an indie bookstore, and I get a little kickback as well, which you'll find a link to in the show notes and on my website. Thanks as always to Carly Quinn for all her help with this episode, Mr. Exploress for my logo, and Joshua Stackhouse for my theme music. Until next time.